My name is Tisha Mitchell, and I am the creator of Decision Clarity. And today we're going to talk about the last minute decision trap, what divorcing women lose when there's no time left to think. Huh. So, you spent your whole life building equity, and you don't want to lose it in the end. So think about the amount of time that it's taking you to build that equity. You can actually lose a big chunk of it when a sale happens on somebody else's timeline. So the problem is not necessarily the house. The problem is that the house decision needs to be made on a divorce timeline collide. They don't always go. So today we're going to show you where money gets lost in this transaction. And most people think that selling a house is simple. You just list it, you price it, you sell it, but divorce changes all that. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So you built this equity. You think about you could lose it in divorce because divorce itself becomes a countdown. And when you're thinking about going through a divorce, you are comparing your home sale to court dates, settlement deadlines, pressure to make a decision quickly. And we know that selling a home is not a quick decision. And there's pressure. You have pressure to make decisions fast, and that pressure changes how you're able to negotiate. Urgency, when not planned properly, can cost you a lot of money. So the calendar can start making financial decisions for you rather than you having a plan in place prior to. At the end of this webinar, you'll know the 6 specific places where divorcing sellers lose their equity, how to protect that equity while the divorce is still moving, how to weigh, keep, and sell or buy out using your real numbers, and what happens to that number once it's split. This deck is going to chat with you a little bit about how that all works. So, we want to be very clear that when you're having a divorce real estate sale, it's not the same as a normal sale. You are focused with that on the court date, the settlement deadline. You are forced to think about how you're going to split that, and you're often doing that very quickly. Most of the time asking to sell it fast, not pricing to sell it right. And so every unnecessary deduction or reduction, it comes out of your equity. So oftentimes in divorce sellers, there's been times where there has been skipped repairs. Neither spouse wants to put any money into the house. And so as a result, buyers will come in and they may see some deferred maintenance. When that happens, they want to start negotiating off the price. The second thing, when you think about, excuse me, your third thing when you're thinking about in leverage is inspection leverage. So the inspection should protect the buyer ordinarily, but divorce pressure changes the negotiation. So one spouse may negotiate things away because they want it over with, while there's another seller that wants to hold out because they're holding for a higher price. Oftentimes, when you're in the negotiations and we're talking about an inspection, there is pressure to accept more credits towards the buyer's closing costs or whatever they desire, or concessions because the buyer knows that you're under pressure. If a buyer decides that you're selling because you're going through a distressed situation, potentially a divorce, then the buyers kind of get savvy and they realize that you're under a deadline. And when that happens, they have more leverage. So they start playing hardball. They start asking questions like, how bad do they really want to sell it? They start knowing that you perhaps maybe are in a bad situation, and they leverage that. And they leverage that by asking for some sort of price concession, whether it is reducing the price or increasing closing costs or other concessions. Also, when you are going through a divorce, you think about what happens if there is a gap between what you're selling the property for, often that's been negotiated in court, and what the property actually appraises for? And what if they don't match? Sometimes sellers even have to go back to court because the number that they agreed to in court was not the real number, and what they actually sell for is significantly different. That makes a huge deal when you are negotiating your equity as part of the division of your marital assets. So if you say, for example, that your house is worth 500,000 and the two of you are set to receive $100,000 each in equity, but the property sells at 450,000. What happens with that equity? Who gets what? And what if you traded off a different asset in your divorce based on the property that you have available selling at 500 and it doesn't? So you've just traded what you thought was equity for maybe liquid cash or retirement accounts or another asset. So it's very, very important. The other thing that we don't think about in a divorce is you're still continuing to pay that mortgage. And sometimes one seller has moved out, another seller has moved on. Maybe you both have gone your separate ways. But the longer it takes to make that sale, the more that you're losing in your mortgage, taxes, and insurance. So those are the six different ways that you can lose equity. And divorce makes every one of them a little bit harder. So we talked about this before. We talked about one of the ways that you lose equity is having to aggressively price, not necessarily market price. You've reduced your price because you want to sell it fast. The second way that you lose equity is when you skip necessary repairs because nobody wants to invest in a property that they're going to lose to their spouse or they're going to have to sell. The third is when buyers understand that you're under pressure and they've had an inspection against those skipped repairs, they have leverage because you are facing a deadline. When they have that leverage, they often are asking for buyer concessions. They want they want you to take more off the price. They want you to sell quickly. They want you to add home warranties. They want all kinds of things. And then we talked about what happens when there is an appraisal gap. And that is the difference between what a house is agreed to as the selling price and what it actually appraises for. The buyers are generally not going to make that up in this market. There was a time where buyers were buying houses really fast and they were willing to pay over. We're not there anymore. And then you have to consider your closing costs. The longer that you're holding on to a property that nobody's living in, nobody's repairing, those holding costs start to add up. And pricing it wrong or could take more time. And I've seen it where sellers had agreed to sell at one price. The property is no longer worth that price, and they can't sell it now because what the market will bear and what they need to cover the costs are out of alignment. So here, Nancy, I want you to, before I move on, I want to just check in with you to see if you have any questions. If so, you can put them in the chat. I'll give you a second. And if the answer is no, you can say no and I can keep going. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. So we talked in the first session of this about the ways that you lose equity in a divorce sale. But now we're going to talk about the ways that you protect your equity in the middle of it. So all the ways that I talked about that you can lose money, it doesn't have to happen if you plan for it in advance. So protecting your equity mid-divorce. You're going to price before the urgency takes over. So if you're going to sell your house, if you know that that's probably where you're going to go, you might want to start thinking about that in the middle of the divorce. And that way you are working with real numbers. At that time, what thing that we want you to remember is that the market determines the price. And we always say to sellers, a house is worth what a ready, willing, and able buyer is willing to pay for it, not what we decide that we need to get out of it. If you're pricing before in the middle of the divorce, you are not in panic mode, right? And then at that point, you can create a strategy early so you are proactive rather than reactive. And then, with that being said, you get to preserve your room to negotiate because you give yourself more time. Second, you get to market the property without tipping your hand, right? At that point, when you go on the market, buyers are looking for stressed sellers. In the middle of the divorce, you are not necessarily as stressed as you are when you have a looming court deadline after things have already been decided. The divorce sale does not have to equal a distressed sale with a plan in place. And when you are deciding that you are going to sell prior to the end of your divorce, you do not have to advertise that you are desperate by consistent price reductions. You are able to test the market and show both your spouse, your ex-spouse, and the court that you are doing what is required to market the property to get the highest value. Oftentimes, if you wait until afterwards, you are not able to go back to renegotiate terms. Third, we talked about evaluating the terms of a sale, not just the price. I'm going to pause. Maybe we didn't. Maybe we didn't. When we think about terms, oftentimes sellers think the highest price is what's best for them. Oftentimes, it is really the terms, and the terms include, can you close when you want to close? Can you close on the date of your choosing? And perhaps the buyers will allow you to stay for a little bit of time while you're actually planning to move forward. That way, you have your equity in your hand before you have to make a decision. Secondly, you get to determine, or you have more runway in considering the closing dates, any possible contingencies. You have runway on their financing, and you have runway on your own financing if your plan is to buy a new house afterwards. Because if you're selling prior to the end of the divorce, you have your exact numbers. If you're trying to get um, if you're trying to get approved for a home in the middle of a divorce, the lender is looking at what your potential equity would be. And like I spoke of earlier in the conversation, if you are planning to sell your house at 500, but it actually only sells at 450, that make a difference as to whether or not you have enough money to put down on your new place. Less money potentially may mean that you're not eligible to buy a new home. This is a snowball effect, and this domino affects many other ones. So you want to make sure, or we're talking through this so we understand what the risks are, because often we don't know. We're not making these decisions prior to, and we find out these very hard things after the fact, and they cost. If you're choosing to negotiate in mid-divorce, then you get to negotiate on your own terms. So you already have information on how real estate and divorce dynamics work together. You need to think about your attorney is going to handle legal issues, and generally legal issues only. I had an attorney that actually decided that the property was worth what Zillow said. She did not take the time to actually get an actual appraisal or get the professional opinion of a realtor. And she was significantly off because Zillow works on an algorithm. It doesn't necessarily work knowing specific market data. So you want to make sure, oftentimes when people are going into divorce, they think that their attorney's going to handle more things than the attorney actually has the capacity and the wherewithal and a professional understanding of. So your attorney handles legal matters, but they don't necessarily understand how real estate impacts that. And in another conversation, in another webinar, we'll talk about how your accountant, your financial planner, your tax advisor, your insurance agent all work in silos, and oftentimes one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing in divorce, but they all impact each other for your financial life moving forward. Again, I digress. I know I got a funny sense of humor. The other thing, when you are making these considerations prior to your divorce, if you're deciding that you're going to protect your equity in the middle, you have time to time the sale during the process, right? You have time before the settlement to map out when the sale is going to happen. You get to get ahead of the court dates. You get to understand your specific financial position prior to going to court because at that point you have actual numbers, not just hypotheticals. And so you get to do what is actually right, proven based on real facts, than just doing what feels easiest at the time. And I want to be very clear with you that in going through court and going through a divorce, they don't really care about what's best necessarily. They talk mostly about what's the most efficient. So here's the real question under all of this, and that is, should you keep it? And if you do, keeping it is a bet on your income alone. And what that means is you're going to keep this property, you're going to finance it on your one income where before you had two. You also need to be thinking about if there's been any deferred maintenance or repairs that will also become yours. And sometimes in a divorce sale, taxes will change. And so you need to make sure that you are accommodating that prior to going to court. So think about when you're keeping the property, you want to think about, will your income continue to carry it? Two, is there some maintenance or deferred maintenance that needs to be taken into consideration? Three, is your job stable? Four, can you qualify for a loan on your own at this specific price point in this specific situation? Say that again fast. Another consideration is, should you sell it? And if you choose that option, you are betting on the market. You are betting that the market is going to give you more than what you would get by staying in place. So we don't always know how the market's going to do. So when you're thinking about that and you're choosing to sell, you need actual factual market data, not necessarily what we think is going to happen. And then finally, a buyout. And a buyout is based on whose number. We talked about before that the value of a property is what a ready, willing, and able buyer is willing to pay for it. Not what Zillow says, not even what an appraisal says. And we'll talk about that in another conversation. It's not what the realtor says that it's going to happen, but it is what a ready, willing, and able buyer is willing to pay for it. However, if you choose a buyout, how will you know what a ready, willing, and able buyer is going to pay for it? And how will you know if you're paying more for that property than the property is actually worth in today's time? Is it the best decision for you, or is one of these other options better? So here's the other thing. With a buyout, we often get caught in what is called the emotional trap. And that is, which choice makes you feel good? Which one makes you feel safer? A familiar house can feel like security. I've lived here forever. I don't want to move. This is my home. But emotional security and financial security are not the same. Staying in this house, will staying in this house cost you more and you'll have less for retirement? Will staying in this house means that you don't have as much for the kids' college? Will staying in this house mean that you don't have more options to rebuild yourself financially? All of those need to be taken into consideration with real numbers, not just this is how I feel. So finally, after the house issue has been settled, what does the number actually mean? There's a difference between the settlement number and cash in your account. Okay. So when you're looking at your price. You're selling for one price. Your mortgage payoff is another price. Perhaps there's some taxes or some other things outstanding that also need to be taken care of. Then you've got your sales costs, which could be your real estate compensation to agents. There's closing costs. There are buyers' concessions where potentially they're asking you for money in escrow for repairs or they're asking for closing costs. Those things are actual numbers. When we look at the price of a house, when we look at the sales price of a house, there's a gap, there's a difference generally. Hopefully, there's a positive gap where there's more money that it's worth more than what you're actually getting. But from that point, you now need to subtract out the other costs associated with selling a house. And generally, that is about 10% of what the property is worth. So if you're thinking about a $500,000 house, you need to be thinking about $50,000 in sales costs. Okay. My name is Tisha, and I am your friend. We talk about keeping the house can actually cost more. We talked about that. The house may feel like stability, but can you carry it alone? Can you pay the mortgage? Can you pay the taxes? Can you pay the maintenance? Can you pay the repairs? And oftentimes those are soft costs that we don't really put numbers to until it's too late. And here's the other thing. The first 30 days matters. What is exactly is supposed to happen with the proceeds of your sale? What financial decisions do you need to make next? Do you need additional insurance? Do you need to buy a car? Do you need to set some things aside for your retirement? Is now your insurance, your health insurance, your car insurance, your house insurance, are they all going to change? Generally, they do. Your coverages are going to change if you are no longer coupled. And then you also want to consider what do you need for the fresh start of your next chapter. So selling the house or buying out your ex isn't the end of the decision. It's the middle. It's the middle. So if you are staring down that choice to keep it, sell it, or settle, you don't want to guess.